Magdeburg, May the 10th, 1631. Catholic troops stormed the proud city on the River Elbe. Their battle cry, Jesus and Mary. Their booty, plenty. Their victims, 20,000 men, women and children, burnt to death or butchered. The conflict in which all this happened would later be known as the 30 Years' War. The obliteration of this powerful city stunned the whole of Europe. A state of siege was nothing unusual in this long war. More than 30,000 inhabitants were surrounded, but they felt safe inside the city's mighty walls. In the past, Magdeburg's strong militia and heavy guns had repelled every attack. Things were unusually calm. The enemy guns had been silent for days. Together with his father, who was Magdeburg's town chronicler, 12-year-old Daniel Frieser was taking a look at the city's fortifications.
My father and I walked along the rampart towards the new town, from the Lachenmacher gates to just past the Elbe gate. The password on this particular night was Angel. The guards at all places along the rampart were well armed.
A deceptive calm lay over Magdeburg. Encamped within sight on the opposite bank of the Elbe was one of the many mercenary armies. Some 30,000 strong, the Catholic forces had completely encircled the town. Magdeburg had been under siege now for more than 6 months, and the enemy was getting closer and closer. Its attackers hoped the proud city would finally capitulate. The mercenaries came from many different countries: Croatia, Hungary, Italy, Spain, and France. Georg Ackermann had fought in many a major battle, first on the Protestant and now on the Catholic side. He'd spent the last 10 years roaming the length and breadth of Europe with the wartime armies. In the 17th century, the smouldering religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants flared up again. A minor provocation escalated into a war that would terrorize people for 30 long years. As was so often the case, in the Holy Roman Empire, along with religion, politics was also involved. The Catholic Habsburg emperors were opposed to the independence of the Protestant princes and cities. It became one of the longest wars Europe had ever seen. So long, in fact, that many people no longer knew what peace was. It started in Prague in Bohemia and swept north via southern Germany.
The war began as a regional conflict in Bohemia. The nobility had turned against their Habsburg ruler. They wanted to remove him and replace him with a different king. The Bohemians chose Frederick V, the Elector of the Palatinate, to be their new monarch, a constellation the Habsburgs were not prepared to accept.
Eine Konstellation, die Habsburg nicht bereit ist hinzunehmen.
In a bloody response, the Habsburgs put down the revolt by the Bohemian princes. But this regional conflict soon escalated into a European war. On the Catholic side was the Habsburg Emperor Ferdinand II, with his commanders Tilly and Wallenstein. They were opposed on the Protestant side by King Christian of Denmark, King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden, and the French First Minister Cardinal Richelieu. Religion was merely an excuse. From Spain to Sweden, from France to Bohemia, rulers sent their troops into the Holy Roman Empire, where they fought to achieve supremacy in Europe.
Lots of political power games were played, which served time and again as a reason for sending troops into the Holy Roman Empire. Funds were made available for subsidizing new armies and ensuring that the war continued, which it did for 30 years.
What made this war particularly horrifying were the huge armies of mercenaries who fought not for faith, but for money, food, and booty. Here it was a case of war nourishes war. Occupied areas had to be redeemed, otherwise they would be plundered. Many peasants let themselves be recruited. They just wanted to survive this long war somehow or other, to become the hunter instead of the hunted. As mercenaries, they took that which in the past soldiers had taken from them. The trade of war became their new profession. The soldiers were accompanied by twice as many followers because they took their families with them. Women and children accompanied the mercenaries on marches which often took years.
It was quite natural for women, for family members, to journey with their menfolk. Doctors, barber surgeons to be more precise, went along. There were sappers who built entrenchments and craftsmen. In fact, these armies were followed by the whole microcosmic spectrum of a city. Then there were the animals, the horses. And every cavalryman had 2 grooms, 2 young lads who looked after his mounts. And of course, there were also the animals for slaughter.
The food supply often decided over victory or defeat. Once a region had been eaten bare, the army had to move on. According to estimates at the time, per day a mercenary needed 1 kilogram of bread, 1 pound of meat, and 3 liters of beer. So for the mercenary armies outside Magdeburg, 30,000 kilograms of bread had to be baked, 75 oxen slaughtered, and 90,000 liters of beer poured every day.
This changed very quickly during the course of the 30 Years' War. The soldiers were thrown back on their own resources. They had to plunder, and the women and children plundered with them. So it made things even worse when this rabble, themselves suffering from hunger and thirst, and with a crumbling code of ethics, impacted on the civilian population.
The mercenaries lived a life of extremes. Like every soldier in war, every morning they wondered whether they'd still be alive in the evening. Plundering made them momentarily rich. Weeks of hunger were followed by days of plenty. With little known about everyday life for the mercenaries, archaeological excavation work in Heidelberg produced a sensational find from the 30 Years' War. The 3,000 fragments and artifacts unearthed provide the first ever insight into what everyday life was like for Tilly's troops. Prior to the find, science had only been interested in the great commanders.
Nahezu unberücksichtigt bleibt der einfache Mensch.
Just how the ordinary soldier and the ordinary soldier's wife lived was virtually ignored. But the Tilly archaeological find has provided us with marvelous proof of what cultural history sources indicated. I'm talking about cutlery. We've excavated a large number of knives.
ausgegraben. Man aß nicht mit Messer und Gabel.
People didn't eat with a knife and fork like we do today. They cut up their food with a knife and put it into their mouths with it. So the reason the Tilly Fine contains so few forks is that the fork was rarely used for pronging food, only as an exception. People did not eat from a fork. Basically, they skewered their food with a knife.
Sondern man spießte sie mit dem Messer beispielsweise auf. Man aß nicht mehr, wie man es
People no longer ate with their hands as they had done in the early and late Middle Ages. First and foremost, they used a knife. We do that ourselves sometimes even today. We cut a hunk of bread and a slice of sausage with a knife and just eat it like that.
Mit Hilfe des Messers.
Outside Magdeburg, Tilly's rabble of soldiers was hoping for rich booty.
This model
shows one of the biggest and richest cities in the old empire. At the time of the 30 Years' War, it had roughly 30,000 inhabitants. But after people flocked in from the surrounding area, that figure probably rose to 35,000. The entire city was walled in with strong fortifications. It was generally regarded as impregnable.
This powerful city on the River Elbe played a decisive role in the wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants. In 1524, Martin Luther preached here for the first time. Magdeburg attracted famous preachers and teachers and quickly developed into a stronghold of the Reformation. It was here that the first Protestant history of the Church was written. Portrayed in the city's coat of arms, the Magdeburg Virgin proudly resisted all Catholic advances. A free Hanseatic city, Magdeburg was one of the biggest and richest towns in Germany, a major center of commerce. The River Elbe favored trade with places all over Europe. Only the city of Magdeburg was allowed to ship grain to Hamburg. It was also accorded the staple right. This meant that all goods being transported on the river had to be unloaded in Magdeburg and offered for sale there first. But after Tilly's troops besieged the town, ships on the Elbe were no longer safe. The King of Sweden had sent some of his troops to Magdeburg as military support. First and foremost, the battle-tried Swedes trained the militia how to use the new muskets. Loading them was a complicated process. However, they had a much longer range than the old crossbow and had far greater penetrating power. In the past, the people of Magdeburg had been able to repulse every attack. They wanted to hold out until help arrived, and it was on its way. King Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden had landed with his army on the German Baltic coast and was heading south. He won battle after battle. By May 1631, his army had already reached Potsdam. Magdeburg was only a few days' march away. In the crowded city, his arrival was longingly awaited. Gustavus Adolphus sent a messenger on ahead, but he fell into the hands of the Catholic besiegers. The lull before the storm. Would the citizens' prayers have been different had they known that the next day all hell would break loose? On the ramparts, everything was quiet. No one suspected that a disaster was in the offing. Daniel Frieser and his father hoped that the siege would soon be over.
No one would have thought that the next morning the city was to fall.
There was uncertainty on the Catholic side too. Tilly, the Catholic commander, knew that if Gustavus Adolphus arrived in time, he would never be able to capture Magdeburg. Time was running out. No one had ever taken a city of this size by storm. Tilly dispatched a final ultimatum. He hoped that Magdeburg would at last capitulate and purchase its freedom. Magdeburg's town hall was a scene of heated debate. Councillors had been arguing all night long over the pros and cons of capitulation. Should they pay so that the Catholic army would at last move on? Or should they hold out and hope that Gustavus Adolphus would arrive in time? Precious time elapsed. Tilly's ultimatum had expired. There would be no new negotiations. Tilly ordered the signal for an attack to be given. For the mercenaries, the long wait was finally over. If the city was stormed, it could be plundered. That was the law of war. The days of hunger and hardship were over, because in Magdeburg, rich booty was waiting. Later, Georg Ackermann wrote, "Before the attack, the general had had all soldiers and officers provided with fine Rhenish wine, which also bolstered their courage." At 7 a.m. the general attack was sounded. 6 rounds fired into Magdeburg New Town by the main battery of guns were the signal for an all-out assault. Captain Georg Ackermann and his men were in the van of the attack. There was such thunderous noise from the muskets, mortars and cannons royal that no one could hear or see a thing. And since the supply units were right behind us, the entire rampart was black with troops and scaling ladders. The mercenaries were spurred on by just one thought: booty, now or never. The attack took the people of Magdeburg completely by surprise. A month previously, the outer fortifications had been reduced. Now Tilly's mercenaries stormed the city walls.
An diesem 10. Mai
On this day, May the 10th, 1631, none of the defenders really thought that an attack would still take place. It was already the 7th hour of the morning, and assaults were usually mounted at the first light of dawn. So the defenders of Magdeburg were lying exhausted on the ramparts when the enemy infantry burst in through the high gate here and, together with the cavalry, went around the bulwark towards the Fisherman's Gate. The Swedish commander of the town, Dietrich von Falkenberg, was still busy trying to convince the Magdeburg City Council that there could only be one course of action, and that was to hang on. So there was the paradoxical situation of enemy troops already fighting inside the city walls, while Dietrich von Falkenberg was still presenting the prospect of imminent rescue by Gustavus Adolphus.
But Gustavus Adolphus would not arrive in time. Magdeburg was on its own. Other cities had redeemed themselves at great expense and thus avoided being plundered. But Magdeburg's town councillors had squandered the opportunity. Tilly's mercenaries made full use of the element of surprise. They knew that once resistance in this huge city became organized, they would have no chance of conquering it. The guards on the church towers sounded the attack and waved the white flag of war. At the same time, the town councillors learnt that the enemy was already inside the city walls. They had pushed their luck and lost, but it was the civilians who would have to pay, the families, women and children. Now it was a case of saving anything that could still be saved. The mercenaries had only reached one part of Magdeburg, but their battle cries already rang out across the entire city. Panic broke out. After 13 years of war, people knew what awaited them once the undisciplined troops reached their homes. Later, Daniel Frieser remembered.
With so much firing going on, you could easily tell that things were going to get very dangerous. We children prayed to God and begged him to spare us.
As yet, all was not lost. After they got over the initial shock, the townspeople put up fierce resistance. They hurled themselves at the mercenaries with a courage born of despair, repulsing the attackers time and again. Our 9 storm columns, each of 3,000 men, were so exhausted by the fighting in the alleyways, some of which had chains stretched across, that we could hardly catch our breath. Chains, man-traps, fire-pots. In Magdeburg's narrow streets, the townsfolk fought with anything they could lay their hands on. With resistance unexpectedly fierce, Georg Ackermann and his men were ordered to set fire to individual houses. The citizens were to fight the blazes, not the invaders. But not a single citizen was prepared to leave the fray in order to douse the flames. In desperation, they all fought on throughout the city. Two hours after the first attack, the people of Magdeburg had to surrender. But driven by a lust for booty and revenge, there was no stopping the mercenaries. The fierce resistance from the civilian population had fueled their anger even more. Now there was no holding them, and nothing was sacred. An eyewitness report. Such was their rage that thousands of innocent men, women and children were piteously murdered, slaughtered in many a horrific manner. Infants whimpering next to their dead mothers were impaled on long pikes. Still alive and screaming, they were carried through the alleyways in triumph, so to speak, until they were finally pitched into the flames.
The main reason for the massacre, I think, was the city's refusal to capitulate. It meant the troops had to attack, that they would have to storm the walls once again, which of course would involve casualties. For me, that's the crux of the matter. The men had to risk their lives once again. After spending weeks and months in the trenches, they would have to face enemy fire yet again. This made them so furious that in their rage they showed no solidarity whatsoever with the townsfolk. And I think this anger is the only explanation for the slaughter which took place.
To flee or to hold out. In absolute desperation, Daniel Fries's parents began to demolish their house themselves, to make it look as if it had already been plundered. It was a trick designed to save the family.
The place looked as if the Furies themselves had rampaged through it. Not long after, the Imperial soldiers in the streets were shouting, "Victory is ours!" They hammered on the doors like the devil himself. We poor people in our houses nearly died of fright.
In their panic, people fled from the murdering rabble in all directions. There were only two really safe places in the city, the cathedral and the monastery of Our Lady, which was run by Catholic monks. Later, one of them wrote down his experiences. The monastery, the cloister and the rooms were so full that you couldn't move. The soldiers had torn the clothes off most of the women to such an extent that they could barely cover themselves, and very few of those released had not been violated. The sight of them touched us deeply. The Frieses still hoped to escape the massacre, to get away somehow or other with their bare lives.
The soldiers shouted and rampaged through our house like evil spirits. Through the tiles we could see our neighbours, the poor souls, being beaten, broken on the wheel and crucified. We all thought our time had come.
The slaughter was so horrific that even some of Tilly's officers complained to him. But Tilly wasn't interested. A soldier, he said, had to have something in return for the hardships and dangers he faced. A storm blew up. There were fires all over the city. There was just no way of stopping them. General Tilly, however, took pity on the beautiful cathedral and immediately assigned 500 foot soldiers to extinguish the flames. For Georg Ackermann, May the 10th was a day of rejoicing. He and his soldiers were still hunting for booty, but the last survivors were not going to surrender their homes without a fight. When the door flew open, a man holding a musket opened fire. The ball just grazed my arm, but it felled a soldier standing right next to me. I wasn't injured, thank goodness. The Frieses were captured. But it was a blessing in disguise, because now this was the only way of escaping from the burning city. Alongside gold and silver, The mercenaries were also keen to get their hands on hostages. Later, they could demand a ransom for them.
The soldiers had conquered a big, wealthy city, and because they'd taken it by storm, they were allowed to pillage for 3 days. That was usage, the ancient right which the troops now enjoyed. For 3 days they were allowed to take whatever they wanted, and here, for the first time, they had the chance to become rich.
Heavy laden, the mercenaries returned to camp. At last they had taken what their commanders had for months been unable to give them: money, booty, food, and women. Their forays had produced rich rewards. The men were satisfied. By now the whole city was ablaze. The soldiers knew that when the flames died down, they'd be returning to the town. After all, they were allowed to plunder for 2 more days, and there was still plenty left to be seized. Roped together, wealthy citizens were dragged into the camp. Those women and girls who had no one to pay a ransom or to intercede for them were indeed in a powerless position. They were totally at the mercy of the soldiers. An uncertain fate also awaited the Frieses.
The soldier's wife was far from friendly to us. "What the devil are you doing?" she asked her husband. "You're filling up the place with children, and I thought you were going to bring back booty." The man placated her, saying that God would provide him with booty. He then brought in a carpet containing sides of bacon. We were glad to have a little protection.
Even the night sky was still stained blood red by the conflagration in Magdeburg. In the camp, the soldiers celebrated their triumph. Georg Ackermann had also seized rich booty, but the fate of the city had not left him unmoved. He was one of the many Protestant mercenaries in the Catholic army. The sight of the city made me sigh. Apart from the cathedral, the monastery, and the new market, it was nothing but a smouldering ruin. The battle had lasted only 3 hours. I saw this as a sign of God's almighty power and divine punishment. In war, fortune and misery are rarely far apart. The mercenaries also suffered casualties. In addition to those killed, many had been seriously wounded. Slashed by sabres, shot in the stomach, or suffering from burns, they were taken into the camp until well into the night. Their chances of survival were slim. In the 16th century, surgeons wrote down their experiences in field notebooks for the first time.
This book is famous, firstly because it was the first of its kind. Written in German, it was based partly on German, partly on Latin sources, and it contains a series of very beautiful and very famous woodcuts. This is a common depiction of the kind of wounds to be treated in the Middle Ages. It shows a figure called the Wound Man, suffering from every possible type of battlefield injury. We see wounds from blows to the head, sword wounds, injuries caused by blunt instruments, gunshot wounds, and lance wounds.
Durch den breiten Einsatz von Schusswaffen ist ein neuerer
Through the widespread use of firearms, a new and actually worse type of injury was occurring on a large scale. To deal with the new types of projectile, a new surgical instrument was also needed. This, for example, is a pair of crane's bill forceps. It was used to get at bullets in areas that were hard to access. The guiding principle was that foreign bodies had to be removed.
Fremdkörper aus dem Körper entfernt.
Today we'd probably say, what's the point? Let's leave the bullet in and allow the wound to heal. Back then, this was out of the question. Surgeons were even prepared to accept further damage to the patient because under no circumstances could a projectile be allowed to remain in the body. So this was quite a sophisticated tool. For example, it enabled surgeons to get at bullets lodged behind the ribs. As you can see, it still works even today.
Bullets and other foreign bodies were thought to be toxic, so they had to be removed at all costs, and the wound cauterized. In other areas, medicine was more advanced.
Und der zweite Punkt ist, dass man bei
The second point involves hemostasis, stopping the bleeding. The big problem with amputations was the huge loss of blood from the main arteries. So surgeons had to make sure that besides cauterizing the large arteries, they also tied them off.
sondern dass man die großen Gefäße auch unterbindet.
Here we have a drawing depicting an innovation which French barber surgeon Ambroise Paré introduced in the late 16th century. As you can see, the hand has already been amputated. One of the large arteries has been pulled out with a pair of forceps. We also see that an assistant is slipping a noose-like thread over the bleeding artery to pull it tight in a knot. This innovatory approach also shows the effort taken to produce a neat stump, which in those days was a major problem. When someone lost their right hand, it meant a considerable drop in their social status, so it was essential to be given a neat stump you could live with afterwards, and surgeons in the early modern era attached great importance to this.
A soldier's life wasn't worth much.
Where their successes are concerned, the accounts by barber surgeons are not exactly euphoric. Naturally, the methods they had tried out are described at length. But when it comes to listing their successes, barber surgeons were extremely restrained. It wasn't so much a case of I've healed hundreds with this approach, but rather one of I've tried it out 100 times, and that, I believe, speaks volumes.
Their hunger for booty drove the mercenaries back into the city. There were still survivors in Magdeburg, but for them the nightmare was by no means over. The scene in the city was one of sheer horror. The alleyways were filled with the stench of charred bodies. The soldiers combed the cellars and ruins once again in search of booty. Anything that seemed of value was taken. And the slaughter continued. Survivors were hunted down and massacred or raped. The proud Magdeburg Virgin had denied herself to the emperor for nearly a century. Now, in a bloody nutshell, she had been taken by force. 2 days after the conquest of Magdeburg, the imperial commander Tilly entered the town. The first thing he did was have the cathedral opened. "3,000 people had fled into the church. While outside the town was being destroyed, inside they prayed and hoped they'd be rescued. They had held out for 2 full days without bread or water. Reinhard Barker, the cathedral preacher, was the first to step forward and ask Tilly for mercy. Those who had sought refuge in the church were spared. The scene that presented itself to the survivors was horrific. The city was just a smouldering pile of ashes, littered with more than 20,000 corpses. Only the cathedral, the monastery, and a few buildings down by the river had survived the catastrophe. Catholic propaganda fated Tilly as a great victor, and the obliteration of Magdeburg as just punishment. The question of personal responsibility or guilt for the death of 20,000 people was never raised. On the 3rd day after the attack, Tilly put a stop to the pillaging. He ordered all his troops to leave the city. Tilly sent a drummer through the ruins and promised to spare those inhabitants who were still alive and had gone into hiding. Panic-stricken, to conceal themselves, they had even crawled under corpses. For the Catholic side, it was a scorched earth victory, one of Magdeburg ash, as contemporary sources referred to it. Tilly had wanted to take an intact fortress, a rich, flourishing city, not a ruin. The destruction of Magdeburg meant that a mark had been overstepped. It was a shock for people all over Europe.
There is a very special dimension to the fate of Magdeburg, because something had also gone wrong on the Protestant side. Gustavus Adolphus had promised to relieve the city and prevent it from falling into imperial hands, but he'd been unable to keep his promise. So it was in the interests of the Swedes and the Protestants to make Magdeburg a major issue. It was highly important, of course, for the Protestant side to be shaken up. And this was achieved in that it became clear to the other Protestant estates of the empire that the war had now attained a certain ferocity and that it was now a conflict in which everything really was at stake.
The war lasted another 17 years. But after the destruction of Magdeburg, the conflict knew no bounds. Many other regions were completely devastated before peace talks finally got underway. In 1648, envoys from the warring parties arrived in Westphalia. For the first time in history, a war was ended at the negotiating table. The signatories to the Peace of Westphalia pledged to accept an order in Europe in which all states enjoyed equality of status. They also promised to acknowledge the different religions. As for Magdeburg, only 449 people remained in this city on the Elbe. It took many decades for it to be rebuilt, and the town never regained its former size and power. The horror continued to have an effect even 200 years later. The inferno is captured in this painting. Rape, pillage, abduction, infanticide. The sack of Magdeburg had burnt itself deep. Georg Ackermann spent many more years fighting in this murderous war. It was only later that he settled in southern Germany and put his experiences down on paper. Daniel Frieser and his family were among the few survivors. They managed to escape from the mercenaries and began a new life somewhere else. It was only as an adult that Daniel Frieser was able to write his account of the siege.
Thus, we escaped from this great storm and tragedy, and we spent the rest of our lives thanking God.
And next week at the same time we'll be surviving the Battle of Sedan, when in 1870 the German army achieved victory over the French, leading to the fall of the Gallic Empire and the establishment of the Third Republic. After the break, it'll be time to encounter the warlord who smashed the crumbling Roman Empire, ransacked its cities, slaughtered its inhabitants, and finally died during a bout of violent sex. It's the real Attila the Hun.